The story begins in a university hospital, where the protagonist sits in silence in the doctor's office, his mind consumed by a single desperate thought: he wants to live. Again, he repeats to himself, clinging to the words with all his strength. He desperately wants to live. The doctor, having carefully examined the report in his hands, finally speaks. With a tone of disbelief, he admits that he has never encountered a case like this before. The disease is so unique that it will likely be named after the protagonist. A heavy silence follows before the doctor continues, offering his condolences. Based on the findings in the report, he says, the protagonist has no more than 6 months left to live. A wave of regret and disappointment washes over the protagonist as the weight of the diagnosis sinks in. Moments later, he finds himself wandering aimlessly through the bustling streets, his steps heavy, his eyes empty. The vibrant city around him blurs into the background, swallowed by the storm raging inside his mind. Suddenly, he stops in the middle of the road. His face twists in despair as reality crashes down on him. This is truly happening. He is going to die in half a year. Pedestrians around him pause, their gazes drawn to the motionless figure standing amidst the moving crowd. Some glance at him with curiosity, others with concern, silently wondering what could have happened to leave him so lost, so broken. At that moment, the protagonist thought about his life, realizing that all he had ever done was work diligently, like a tireless worker ant. For a brief moment, it had seemed as if things were finally looking up for him, as if his life was finally taking a turn for the better. But that moment had been fleeting, vanishing in an instant with the devastating news that he had only a few months left to live. With his mind consumed by this cruel reality, he resumed walking, his movements empty and lifeless. The world around him faded into nothingness, the bustling city drowned out by the overwhelming weight of his thoughts. He was unaware of his surroundings, too lost in the shock of what he had just learned. Then, a voice broke through the haze. A passing pedestrian, noticing him standing in the middle of the road, called out and urged him to move, warning him of the danger. Without waiting for a response, the pedestrian reached out and shoved him onto the sidewalk, forcing him out of harm's way. The protagonist stumbled and fell to his knees, his hands pressing against the cold pavement. As he landed, a piece of paper slipped from his pocket, fluttering gently to the ground. His gaze fell upon it, and in that moment, a bitter thought surfaced: how unfair it was to be told he had mere months to live, especially on this very day, the day he had won the lottery jackpot. As if the heavens themselves shared in his sorrow, the rain began to fall. Kneeling on the wet pavement, he lifted his tear-filled eyes to the sky, his body trembling as he repeated the same desperate words. He wanted to live. He did not want to die. His voice, raw with emotion, pleaded for someone, anyone, to save him from this cruel fate. And as he wept, the raindrops mixed with his tears, falling endlessly onto the cold, indifferent streets. Life sometimes follows a plan, and other times, it takes an unexpected turn. For the protagonist, it was both. His wish had been granted, he was able to live, but not in the way he had intended. Though he had desperately pleaded for life, he had never meant that he was willing to accept his current form. Out of all the possibilities, he could not understand why he had to be reincarnated as a bald skeleton. Worse still, there was little joy to be found in living this way. At present, he was on a mission, one that required him to complete a quest and conquer the battlefield by exterminating all rebellious forces. After countless battles against monstrous foes, he emerged victorious. As the last of the rebels fell, he took a moment to acknowledge his success. The mission was complete, and the final enemy had been vanquished. Thinking back to the moment of his reincarnation, he recalled the strange fate he had been given. Reborn as a skeleton, an inferior-class summon monster, he had started at the very bottom. Yet, through relentless effort and countless battles, he had grown stronger, eventually reaching the point where he evolved into an undead of a higher order, a lich. The day he ascended to this new form was unlike any other. Thousands of monsters, his loyal subordinates, erupted in celebration, their voices filling the air as they cheered for him. They called him their king, their undying sovereign. To them, he was more than a powerful undead, he was their savior. Through his strength and leadership, he had led demonkind out of the depths of despair, pulling them back from the brink of ruination and bringing prosperity to a race that had once stood on the edge of extinction. As the protagonist listened to the deafening cheers of his subordinates, he suddenly found himself blushing from the overwhelming praise being showered upon him. He might not have had any hair, but at least he was the great demon king. That thought alone gave him some comfort. The demon monsters called out to him, referring to him as Isaac, claiming that even his name sounded powerful and ominous. Their excitement only grew as they began chanting his name once again, their voices echoing across the battlefield. However, their enthusiasm quickly turned into an irritation for him. They had gotten his name wrong, again. With an exasperated sigh and an irritated demeanor, he reminded them that he was tired of repeating himself. What they were calling him was not his real name. His true name was Isaac. But just as he corrected them, his expression shifted, his irritation fading into amusement. Addressing his subordinates once more, he called them a bunch of numbskulls, pointing out how ridiculous it was that they could not even pronounce their own king's name properly. Then, without hesitation, he declared that it was time for him to bid them farewell. At that moment, one of his subordinates hesitantly stepped forward and asked where he was planning to go. Isaac responded without hesitation, he was going to claim what was rightfully his. As those words left his lips, his face lit up with joy. Finally, after all this time, he was going to achieve his ultimate goal. He would be able to eat, to feel pain, to experience life once again. He was going to become human. Moments later, Isaac arrived in the divine realm, standing in the presence of the gods. In his grasp was the severed head of the leader of the rebellious forces, a clear sign of proof that he had completed the quest. Facing the gods, Isaac declared that the task was done. He had eradicated every faction that had dared to challenge them. With a firm tone, he reminded them of their promise, hoping they had not conveniently forgotten. It was written in the contract, once the mission was complete, they were to return him to his human form. The gods were taken aback. The quest had been designed to take at least 500 years, yet Isaac had accomplished it within just a few. Murmurs spread among them, two of the gods whispering to each other in hushed voices. This mission had never been meant for him to succeed so quickly. It had been a carefully crafted scheme by the higher-ups, a ploy to turn him into their eternal servant without reward. Though they believed their voices to be discreet, Isaac heard them clearly. Without hesitation, he turned his gaze toward them and called them out. His tone was sharp, making it clear that their whispered deception had not gone unnoticed. Despite his skeletal face, his troubled expression was unmistakable as he questioned the gods. Why were they stalling? They had made a promise, if he took care of their enemies, they would restore his humanity. He had done everything they asked, fulfilled every condition, and yet here they were, finding excuses to delay. At that moment, one of the gods stepped forward with a bright expression and told Isaac that if he were to complete just one more task, they would undoubtedly grant his wish. However, upon hearing this, Isaac was consumed by rage. He knew exactly what was happening. The gods must have thought he was nothing more than an empty-headed skull, easily manipulated and deceived. Though he had no physical eyes, the sockets of his skull burned with a crimson glow, fueled by his growing fury. Without hesitation, he demanded to know what kind of fool they took him for. He was no pushover, and whether they were gods or not, they would pay for their deceit. The air grew thick with an overwhelming pressure as Isaac unleashed his magic, his aura distorting the very space around him. His power surged through the divine realm, shaking the foundations of their so-called authority. Glaring at them, he asked if they had truly made him go through all that effort despite lacking the means to turn him human again. In hushed voices, one of the gods turned to another, whispering that Isaac might have caught on to their deception. The other god let out a sigh, admitting that this was precisely why he had opposed the idea from the very beginning. He then questioned why she had ever agreed to make a contract with a lowly maverick like Isaac in the first place. But whispering was pointless. Isaac could hear them just as clearly as if they had spoken aloud. With a sharp tone, he addressed them once more, his patience long gone. Was this truly all they had to say for themselves? Isak then addressed the gods once more, declaring that as a being summoned through forbidden arts, he existed beyond the natural order. He was imperishable, unaffected by the passage of time, and incapable of dying from old age due to his undead nature. His very existence defied the laws of the world, making him a threat even to the divine realm itself. With a sharp and unforgiving tone, he turned to the gods and made his final declaration. If these incompetent deities were incapable of keeping their promise and lacked the power to return him to human form, then they would all pay the price with their lives. Panic spread among the gods as his words sank in. Desperate, they pleaded for more time, scrambling to find an excuse. One of them suggested that if Isak took care of just a few more problems for them, they would grant his wish. But Isak had reached his limit. His patience had long since worn thin, and his fury could no longer be contained. A surge of power erupted from him, engulfing the entire chamber in a blinding red aura. The divine realm trembled as the overwhelming force spread through the air, and the gods, now trembling, realized the situation had spiraled beyond their control. With a menacing laugh, Isak raised both hands, gathering a sphere of crackling energy, ready to unleash destruction upon those who had deceived him. The gods braced themselves, panic evident on their faces. But just as he was about to strike, everything changed. His magic flickered, then faded entirely. The once thick aura that had filled the room vanished, and a suffocating silence took its place. Confusion overtook him as he tried to move, only to find his body unresponsive. His voice broke through the silence, filled with disbelief. Something was wrong. His mana was fading. His body refused to obey him. Someone, had stripped him of his power. As Isak struggled to understand what was happening to him, one of the gods smirked and told him that resistance was futile. With a casual wave of his hand, the god summoned a magical pen, and in his other hand, a millipede appeared, its segmented body covered in intricate, glowing inscriptions. The god then explained that struggling would be pointless. Those whose names were written upon the creature would be rendered completely immobile, no matter where they were. This spell, known as Banish Disaster, was the highest class of holy arts, a technique created specifically to seal away catastrophic beings like Isak. With a smug expression, the god continued, saying that Isak should be grateful they had even allowed him to serve their purposes for so long. He was nothing more than a lowly demon, unworthy of challenging the gods. With that, the god declared that from now on, Isak would live his life as an insignificant bug. Isak, however, let out an exasperated sigh and retorted that if they were going to turn him into an insect, they could have at least chosen something like a fuzzy caterpillar. The gods, momentarily caught off guard, exchanged confused glances before asking why he was so obsessed with hair. Before they could press the matter further, the bug in the god's hand suddenly emitted a radiant golden light. The gods watched in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what was happening. Unlike them, Isak was all too aware of what was unfolding. With a menacing laugh, he mocked the gods, calling them fools for taking too long to act. They had made a critical mistake. They had foolishly revealed their trump card without finishing him off first. And now, it was too late. As Isak spoke, his entire body began to glow with a brilliant golden light. With a defiant smirk, he declared that he would rather destroy himself than spend an eternity as a mere insect under the gods' rule. The gods, realizing his intent, scrambled to stop him, but it was already too late. Just before he detonated, Isak left them with one final insult, telling them to eat dirt. In the next instant, a massive explosion erupted, shaking the divine realm with its sheer force. When the dust finally settled, the gods remained intact, though visibly irritated by what had transpired. One of them scoffed, calling Isak insane for choosing to self-destruct rather than accept his fate. Turning their attention to the millipede in one of the gods' hands, the vessel meant to contain Isak's soul, one of them asked whether the sealing spell had successfully taken effect. The god holding the millipede examined it closely before nodding, confirming that the spell had activated and that the demon king's soul was now trapped within the creature. Hearing this, the gods collectively sighed in relief. One of them spoke up, stating that with the demon king gone, they should be able to regain their lost power. The others agreed, noting that every time a demon perished, the god's strength naturally increased. However, amid their celebration, one of the gods cautioned the rest, reminding them that they could not afford to lower their guard just yet. Though Isak had been dealt with, there was no telling when another calamity of his magnitude might be born. At that moment, one of the gods proposed creating the perfect vessel for a saint in the human realm, one capable of exterminating every last demon. Another god questioned whether he would be able to handle such a task, as it would consume a significant amount of his divine power. However, the first god dismissed their concerns, assuring them that he could manage. He then instructed the others to select a suitable soul to inhabit the saint's body. Turning his attention to the millipede, he sneered and declared that as for the insolent skeleton demon king, he would spend all eternity suffering as a lowly insect. A menacing grin spread across his face as he imagined the torment Isak would endure. However, unbeknownst to the gods, Isak was very much alive, and his soul had never been sealed inside the millipede as they had assumed. With his eyes closed, Isak reflected on his situation, chastising himself for having been deceived by the gods so easily. He wondered if he had truly lost his mind or if being a brainless skeleton had made him more gullible. As he continued his thoughts, a sudden brightness pierced through his closed eyes. Confused, he questioned why it was so blinding and instinctively tried to shield his face. But instead of skeletal fingers or insect limbs, he saw tiny human hands before him. A wave of warmth and dampness surrounded him, further adding to his bewilderment. Realization slowly dawned as he examined himself, and the thought struck him, he might have been reborn into the body of a human. Isak, still reeling from his unexpected situation, thought to himself that the gods must have wanted him dead, and he wondered if they had somehow messed up the seal. Just then, one of the maids spoke up, announcing that the saint, referring to Isak, had woken up. Isak was immediately confused, not understanding why they were calling him a saint. The maid, with a bright smile, asked why he had woken up from his nap, while a butler holding a bottle of milk commented that it would have been better if the baby had just kept sleeping. Isak, still disoriented, wondered where he was and what was happening. He questioned if the people in front of him were nannies and if, somehow, he had truly been transformed back into a human. One of the nannies spoke up, telling baby Isak that it couldn't be helped that he had woken up. Both nannies then flashed an unsettlingly evil smile. The maid, with a tone of false sympathy, told Isak that she felt bad about what was about to happen, but that they had their jobs to do. She added that, despite Isak just waking up, they needed him to go back to sleep, this time, forever. Panic surged through Isak as he heard those words. In that moment, he realized that he had just died, and now he was facing the terrifying prospect of dying again. The butler, with a menacing smile, apologized to baby Isak and told him that they were going to put him to sleep forever. As he said this, the butler stretched out his arms, holding the bottle, aiming to place it into Isak's mouth. However, just as the bottle neared Isak's lips, he quickly dodged it. Undeterred, the butler continued to try, again and again, attempting to feed him the bottle, but Isak skillfully dodged each time. The butler, both devastated and shocked, could not understand why Isak refused to drink what he was offering, while Isak, keeping his back turned, thought to himself that they must be joking with him. He had finally become human, so there was no way he was going to drink something so suspicious from the butler. In that moment, Isak shifted his thoughts, wondering how he had even become human in the first place. One of the two caretakers spoke up, telling Isak that he needed to eat like a baby should and sleep forever, soundly. They then referred to Isak as Sir Isaac. This caught Isak by surprise. He remembered that back when he was with the monsters, they would often call him Lord Isaac instead of his real name, Isak. It occurred to him that this was a mispronunciation of his name, and when the gods had written it on the millipede to banish him, they had mistakenly written it as Isaac instead of Isak. Isak, upon realizing the situation, thought to himself that this must be the reason he was still alive and breathing. Not only had he avoided being sealed, but he had also reincarnated into a different body with the same name. Laughing menacingly, Isak reveled in the fact that the gods had been fools, thinking they had defeated him, but in reality, they had failed to seal him away. However, as Isak continued to laugh, the butler suddenly forcefully placed the bottle in his mouth, startling Isak. Both parties struggled, with the butler asking the maid for help, as Isak, despite being a baby, was surprisingly strong. As Isak tasted the drink, his face turned pale at the horrible flavor of the vegetable juice. In his mind, he wondered if they were trying to kill him with such disgusting food. Having finally become human, he did not want to die again. As he continued drinking more of the awful liquid, Isak felt weaker and weaker. He could sense something ominous entering his body, and in that moment, he saw the menacing smiles of the maid and the butler. In the next instant, he passed out. Moments later, inside the Holy Empire Hela Central East Temple, an old man who had earned the title of bishop walked down the corridor, laughing menacingly as he thought about something. With a sinister smile, the bishop thought to himself that the baby, Isak, should be meeting his end right about now. However, just as he was lost in this thought, a voice called out to him, commenting that he seemed particularly lively. The bishop turned in the direction of the voice and saw none other than Emperor Alexander Heathcliff Hela, the ruler of the Holy Empire. The bishop, along with his subordinates, immediately bowed respectfully to the emperor. The emperor then spoke, asking the bishop what business he had there. With a light smile, the bishop replied that he and his subordinates had come to greet the saint candidate of House Ashwa and added that the Holy See must be present in regard to the Holy One. The emperor, his expression turning vicious, retorted that it sounded as though the bishop found this responsibility burdensome, especially considering it was a saint. He continued, warning the bishop that it would be a major problem if anything went wrong after the saint candidate was placed under the Holy See's care. The bishop, upon hearing the emperor's words and seeing his expression, began to panic. He feared the emperor might have discovered what he had done to the baby who had been announced as the saint. As the emperor spoke, the bishop quickly apologized, claiming to have no idea what the emperor was referring to. But at that moment, a cry echoed from the room where the baby was sleeping. At that moment, as the emperor spoke, a sudden voice was heard from the room where the baby was sleeping. The emperor, upon hearing the noise, was filled with panic, fearing something might have happened to the baby. On the other hand, the bishop, hearing the cry of the baby, smiled menacingly to himself, thinking that the job was done and the baby had been finished off. The emperor quickly ran toward the room, bursting through the door. In a state of urgency, he shouted at the maid, demanding to know what had happened to the young master, Isak. The maid, hearing the emperor's concern, calmly explained that the baby was so cute, she had unintentionally shouted in excitement. Everyone in the room was taken aback by her response. The maid then proceeded to point out how adorable Isak was, noting how plump the baby's belly had become and how well he had eaten. She described him as a cute little angel. Meanwhile, Isak, with a radiant smile, seemed to glow like an angel, embodying the image of innocence. The butler, joining in, commented on how much the baby had drunk, revealing that it was already the 15th bottle of tasteless vegetable juice that Isak had finished. The bishop, however, was far from pleased with the situation. Things were not going as he had planned at all. As he glanced at the multiple bottles scattered on the ground, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The baby, Isak, was still alive after consuming all of them, and the bishop muttered in disbelief that those bottles didn't just contain vegetable juices. Just a few minutes earlier, Isak had been fed one of the bottles that contained not only vegetable juice but also other mysterious contents. At that moment, Isak, feeling an ominous sensation spreading through his body, thought to himself that he was likely going to die again. The contents of the bottle seemed deadly, and he wondered if this was how he would perish. But as he processed the situation further, he was suddenly struck by realization: the liquid inside the bottle was not just some regular substance, but holy poison. Holy poison was a dangerous and insidious toxin, specifically crafted to destroy the holy powers of those in the clergy. It didn't have an immediate effect, but it was still deadly if enough accumulated in the body. However, in Isak's case, the poison was made from demon mana, and as a former demon king, it was the perfect substance for him. Far from being harmed by it, Isak found the mana-infused poison incredibly invigorating. Not only was it beneficial to him, but he also craved more, knowing it would help replenish his energy. With a feeling of contentment radiating from him, Isak, now emitting an aura of happiness, decided he would eagerly consume every drop of this mana-rich baby food being fed to him. As Isak thought about all of this, he suddenly began throwing a tantrum, clearly signaling to the maid and the butler that he wanted more of what they were feeding him. The butler, confused by Isak's actions, asked the maid if the baby wanted more of the strange liquid they had been feeding him. Seeing the baby's insistence, the butler hesitated for a moment but then took out another bottle, clearly troubled by the situation, and began feeding Isak again. As he did, he spoke to the baby, telling him that they were happy to continue feeding him this vegetable juice mixed with poison mana. While feeding Isak, the butler commented to the maid that this was to be expected, as the poison's effects wouldn't manifest immediately. They just needed to wait and continue feeding the baby in the meantime. Isak, on the other hand, was overjoyed by the prospect of more, happily accepting the bottle as his mana steadily increased with each sip. He couldn't help but compliment the person who had crafted this concoction for him, appreciating the effort they had put into it. As he drank, Isak shifted his focus. He thought to himself that what he needed to do next was to enter the world beyond the conscious mind, the unconscious realm. In the deepest part of this world, at its very source, Isak resolved to create a mana core. He recognized that this would become his safe haven, a place where he could grow stronger. As Isak celebrated his success, he quickly calmed himself and reminded himself to focus. He told himself that he needed to put the mana he had absorbed into the mana core. Gathering the mana within his body, he focused, and soon a bright yellow ball of mana began to form. As the ball took shape, Isak thought to himself that he needed the mana core to be able to use magic later. He decided to prepare it now so that it would be easier to use in the future. However, as the mana core continued to form, it suddenly began to glow even brighter than before. Isak's calmness faltered as he panicked, unsure of what was happening. This was not something he was controlling. He wondered if this was some sort of mana explosion. After a few moments, Isak took a closer look at the mana core and was startled to see something unusual. The mana core, which should have been one of the 3 primary colors, was instead white. Isak was confused. He had clearly remembered that a mana core should be one of the traditional colors. But as he pondered this, he quickly shifted his focus. The color, he realized, wasn't the main issue. The real problem was the sheer amount of power contained within this small, still-forming mana core. He couldn't believe how much energy was already present, even though the core wasn't fully formed yet. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.